capitalist class because they hope to capitalize the land, turn the land into commodities and then into capital, and do this through the sugar plantation in the 1640s, in the very time of the English Revolution or the English Civil War. It's an amazing story of conquest, cruelty, and God.
So if you look at something like the southern states of America, up until the point of the American Civil War, the greatest amount of wealth in America was the ownership of slaves and slave labor. Now this is enormous. And it's in that process of being able to command the resources of other parts of the world, extract them for your industries, and that labor, that you create this massive structural inequality.
The British become well off on the basis of the slave system. Liverpool, Bristol grow to kind of extraordinary levels of material and urban well-being because of the slave system. Lloyd's of London, the Bank of England, Barings Bank, Barclays Bank, Lord Harwood at Harwood House, stately homes left, right and centre are absolutely rooted in this slave system. But it's a slave system that needs a justification. That is the kind of racist element in it. But the real rationale for it is profit.
The sort of laundering of slave profits, as opposed to simply the relocation of them in economic enterprises, is, I think, a very important part of the modern development of Britain. For example, I always think of Bristol, the development of Clifton and so on and so forth, absolutely tied to the slave profits from the 18th century, early 19th century slave trade.
Slavery as it existed in parts of Europe prior to this period of the Atlantic slave trade was not particularly color-coded. Yes, the slaves in Western Europe might be Slavs, but, you know, they have the same skin color, and you couldn't tell by looking at somebody whether he was a slave or not. But, you know, by the time you get to the West Indies in 1700 or something, you can tell by looking at somebody whether or not he or she is a slave.
The ancients, by and large, did not suffer from that form of race identification and slavery based on race, but they had their own version of it, which was that all foreigners, all non-Greeks, all outsiders, in principle, could be enslaved legitimately because they were inferior. It's not just people who are not Greek who are regarded as inferior in this sort of unalterable way, but Greek men regarded Greek women in somewhat the same way. So if you are male and Greek, you belong just by that very fact to superior categories.
To begin with, racial feeling can take simply the form of aversion, of dislike. But in the case of New World slavery, what it's doing is taking the form of domination, of exploitation, something much more coherent, something much more purposeful. It's not just a casual prejudice against people who are unlike ourselves. It's a determination to use those people who are unlike ourselves. So it's this that creates the more intense racial feeling that comes out of the widespread adoption of slavery in the plantations in the Americas.
In antiquity, defenders of the institution of slavery didn't rely on ideas of racial inferiority or skin colour to justify it, but the ideas of one of the great thinkers of antiquity, who was much quoted in the Valladolid debates, would be adapted to the context of New World slavery.
Aristotle, if I could use an awful phrase, is the nigger in the woodpile, because his views were looked back to from the later medieval period onwards and cited because Aristotle was regarded as, though unfortunately he wasn't a Christian, he lived too early, nevertheless he was the next best thing. And if he said slavery was a natural phenomenon, then it probably was. But it's very important to be clear that Aristotle was not speaking in terms of external racial characteristics, colour.
Genesis chapter 9, verse 25. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted...
An authority even greater than Aristotle's was invoked to justify slavery. God and his good book. Genesis chapter 9 verse 25 was interpreted by Christians as divine authorization for trafficking in slaves and the ownership of plantations.
Oh, and this is kind of a funny story, and from our perspective it seems sort of ridiculous, but this was taken very seriously indeed. After the flood, Noah gets out, there are still waters all around, and so Noah decides he's going to set up a vineyard. Noah gets drunk. He has 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Ham goes into Noah's chamber while he's lying in this inebriated state, and then takes off the sheet, looks down at Noah, and then calls in his brothers.
And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father.
And says, "Look at our father who's lying naked," and tries to get his brothers to laugh. When Noah comes round from his stupor, he's furious, and he pronounces a curse on Ham's descendants.
And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren."
So he says that Ham's son, who's called Canaan, will from then on be cursed in perpetuity, and he'll be a slave to the other 2 brothers, Shem and Japheth.
The curse of Ham was not specifically black from the beginning. There was a medieval writer representing the lords of the manor saying the peasants are the descendants of Ham, and that's why they have to serve. The word slave originally originated from Slavic, and these were people who had been captured on the eastern frontiers of Europe. And it was not until about the 15th century, when the Portuguese in West Africa began to specifically identify Africans with the curse.
But the idea is that one branch of the human family has been enslaved because of this curse, which Noah pronounced on Ham.
It's a kind of one-size-fits-all oppressors story, because you can decide whatever group it is that you want to enslave or oppress are the descendants of Ham, and therefore you have a biblical justification for your mistreatment of them.
Christianity it does different things at different times. In other words, there's certainly a strand of thinking in which people justify slavery by arguing that it's bringing people in Africa into Christianity and so forth.
Christianity is just one aspect of a number of different systems of thinking that would create the colonial basis for the kinds of knowledge which will be used to define non-European populations. So you move from Christianity to liberalism, to notions of humanitarianism, to capitalism. All these kinds of interventions are part of trying to manage and make sense of what the colonial enterprise is without questioning the colonial enterprise, without questioning what Atlantic slavery is.
Christianity's role in slavery is very complex. For most of its history, it basically accepted slavery as part of the order of things. In a way, the parallel would be the attitude towards a homeless person today. I mean, we see it not as a sin or as evil, but as an unfortunate situation. And this continued right up to the middle of the 18th century, when a truly radical change took place in which some Christian thinkers began to see slavery as a sin.
Enslavement of the natives of North America was never European policy, but that didn't make life any easier for these indigenous peoples, whose relationship with the settlers would ultimately leave most of them either victimized or dead.
If you look at Native Americans from their perspective, when white people arrived, they were a disruption, they were shocking, and they were surprising in all sorts of ways. But for many Indians, they simply looked at them as another rival group. And this is one of the interesting facts about 17th century American history. From Indians' perspectives, whites were in a way a bit similar to other rival Indian nations. So perhaps you'd trade with whites, perhaps you'd make war with whites, perhaps you'd ally with the whites against another Indian nation. Indians didn't see things in white and red, if you want to put it that way, white and red terms, because the white settlements weren't powerful enough until much later in the 17th century, even into the 18th century. So they didn't see this as an invasion, as a form of genocide, in a way that would unite them as Indians against white people.
The ways and thoughts of the white men are strange.
But for all that our skins are of different hues, we are friends, Chingachgook.
You could talk about the 18th century as a 100-year period in which Indians increasingly realize that the battle is between them and white people. And in 1763, when it became clear to a host of different Indian groups in the Midwest that the wind was changing, they launched a rebellion. It was led by an Ottawa Indian named Pontiac, laid siege to the British fort at Detroit. He didn't succeed in destroying the fort, but he got the people there very scared indeed. And it made London aware of the problem of managing Indians, especially in the Midwest. And one of the most extraordinary things that happened is that George III declared in the autumn of 1763 a line of proclamation. That's what it was called, the line of proclamation, which forbade any white settler from settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains without his explicit permission. So effectively, the idea was to put the brakes on white settlement to preserve British trading relationships with the Indians. But of course, the irony here is you've got tons of white settlers moving to America looking for land. So in effect, in 1763, this royal proclamation creates a new tension between ordinary white settlers on the ground and the Crown. And it's definitely one of the contributing factors in the American Revolution. White settlers believe after 1763 that the British government doesn't support them and instead it backs the Indians. And after the American Revolution, or in the process of the American Revolution, the gloves really come off for white Americans, and the new United States is not an Indian-friendly nation in the least.
Native Americans were in an impossible situation. Side with the British, whose stronghold was Fort Detroit, and they risked the wrath of the rebel colonists based in Fort Pitt. Side with these Americans and their militiamen, and they would invite merciless retribution from the British. And as for trying to stay out of it, even if you were in Pennsylvania, a state founded by Quakers upon principles of Christian brotherly love, this too could have fatal consequences.
Now, one group that didn't pick one side or the other were the Moravian Christian Indians, who were gathered in 3 little communities, the most important of which was called Gnadenhutten. These Moravian Christians, there are maybe 100, 150, had tried to stay out of the war. They weren't hostile Indians. They had adopted many of the customs, the equipment, the technology of white people. They read the Bible. They sang hymns. They were, to all intents and purposes, the dream model of people back in the 17th century who wanted to convert and civilize Indians. And then a group of Pennsylvania militiamen arrived. When they had taken everything that they had that could be construed as a weapon, tools, axes, whatever, that the Indians had, which could be used against them, the militiamen got together and decided to kill every one of them. So every single Indian, in fact, the majority were women and children. I think there were around 30 men, so the rest, 60 or so, were women and children. All of them were massacred. They were brought in pairs to a hut where they were hit over the head with a cooper's mallet. And their brains were dashed out without any regard to their obviously being non-combatants. And at the end of the massacre, the white militiamen